Edward I's story really begins long before he tried to break Scotland. Because he grew up in an England that had seen years of disorder, weak kingship, and frustrated nobles who no longer feared their ruler. He was born into a royal family that struggled to command real authority, and as a young prince, he watched his father, Henry III, bend again and again to the demands of powerful barons. Edward hated seeing the crown look fragile. He believed a king should be respected, obeyed, and maybe even feared if necessary. That belief would shape almost every decision he made later in life. People remembered him as tall, strong, and intimidating, and even those who didn't like him admitted he had presence. When Edward walked into a room, people moved. When he finally became king in 1272, he wasted no time showing that he was not going to be a weak or uncertain ruler. He spent years reorganizing laws, tightening royal control, and building a kingdom where order came from the top down. Many people admired that side of him. He could be fair, thoughtful, and surprisingly patient when dealing with complex disputes. But he also had a harsher side. If someone challenged him, he pushed back with overwhelming force. That was how he saw kingship: protect the realm, punish threats, strengthen the crown. It didn't matter if the threat came from an enemy army or from his own people. That same mindset shaped his early dealings with Wales. At the time, Wales was not a single united country, but a collection of smaller power centers. Edward made agreements, broke agreements, made demands, and slowly tightened control. When the Welsh princes resisted, he marched in with armies, built massive stone castles across the land, and left the Welsh people with no doubt that England had taken over. To Edward, it wasn't personal. It was just how a king secured his borders. But to the people of Wales, it felt like an invasion that stripped them of their freedom. This pattern: negotiation, pressure, resistance. Then overwhelming force would repeat when he turned his attention north. Scotland had always been England's northern neighbor, usually peaceful but never fully under English influence for years. The two kingdoms lived side by side, sometimes trading, sometimes arguing, but rarely going to war. Everything changed when the Scottish king, Alexander III, died suddenly in 1286. With him gone, Scotland had no clear adult ruler, and the nobles struggled to agree on who should lead. Edward saw an opportunity. When the Scottish guardians asked him to help choose the next king, he agreed, but only if he was recognized as Scotland's overlord. Most of the Scottish nobles didn't like it, but they went along because they wanted to avoid civil war. Edward promised to be fair, and for a moment, it seemed like things would remain peaceful. He chose John Balliol as king, partly because Balliol seemed easy to control. But once John was crowned, Edward treated him less like an independent king and more like a noble who owed obedience. He demanded money, military support, and formal recognition of English authority. The Scots grew angry. John Balliol grew humiliated. When Scotland finally pushed back and made an alliance with France, Edward reacted the way he always reacted when someone challenged him. He gathered his armies and marched. What followed didn't feel like a border dispute. It felt like an attempt to break a nation. Edward moved quickly and brutally. He stormed Berwick, a town that resisted him, and the fighting there was so savage that even chroniclers loyal to Edward admitted thousands died. To Edward, the destruction served a purpose. It sent a message. When he captured John Balliol, stripped him of his royal symbols, and publicly humiliated him, he believed he was restoring order. But the Scots saw it as a foreign king tearing down their independence. During all of this, Edward didn't think of himself as a villain. He believed Scotland belonged under English influence, and he believed he had the right to enforce that in his mind. He wasn't destroying Scotland. He was fixing it, stabilizing it, and bringing it under strong, lawful rule. And for a while, he thought he had succeeded. With their king gone and their government dismantled, the Scots looked beaten. Edward installed English officials, English sheriffs, English judges, even English laws. He took the most precious relics of Scottish kingship and brought them south as trophies. Back in London, people praised him as a strong king who had expanded English power. But Scotland wasn't done. Edward had misunderstood something important. He thought removing the king would remove resistance. Instead, it sparked it. Local leaders, lords, Common farmers, people from every level of society, began to push back. They didn't unite under one idea at first, but they shared the same anger. To them, it wasn't only about laws or taxes. It was about dignity. The English were now in their towns, their courts, their fortresses, and even their churches. That built resentment faster than any invasion could. Edward didn't see the storm forming. He believed Scotland had been subdued and moved on to other matters, thinking only a few scattered rebels remained. He didn't know that a minor noble named William Wallace was gathering support, or that resentment was turning into a full-blown movement. When news reached him that Wallace's forces had defeated an English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, Edward was shocked. To him, Wallace was not a knight, not a king, not a noble, just a man leading ordinary Scots. And yet that man had undone months of English control in a single day. This defeat lit something inside Edward that had not been seen since his younger years. He felt personally challenged, personally insulted, and he responded with the full force of his kingdom. He prepared an army that dwarfed Wallace's. He spent enormous amounts of money, pulled in soldiers from across his lands, and marched north again. When he finally met Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk, the result was devastating for the Scots. Wallace's forces were brave but outmatched. Edward's cavalry and archers shredded them. When the battle ended, Wallace escaped, but Scotland's rebellion looked broken. But even then, Scotland refused to stay quiet. It turned into something Edward couldn't fully understand, more than a rebellion. Almost a national identity forming under pressure. Every time he thought he had ended the fight, a new leader appeared. Every time he believed Scotland was beaten, it rose again. Edward kept marching north again and again, furious that the Scots refused to stay defeated. To him, the whole conflict had gone beyond politics. It felt like a personal struggle to prove that the English crown could not be challenged. He saw Scotland the same way he had once seen rebellious nobles in England or defiant princes in Wales. They needed to be brought under control so the realm could remain stable. But the Scots didn't think of themselves as subjects refusing obedience. They were people trying to hold on to something older than Edward understood. Each time he tried to crush resistance, Scotland seemed to grow more determined. After William Wallace was forced into hiding, Edward believed the rebellion would fade away. Instead, new leaders stepped forward. Some were nobles, others were men who had lost land, family, or freedom because of the war. They were tired of English officials treating their country like a conquered province. Scotland was still fractured, but slowly, the idea of driving the English out became stronger than their rivalries. Edward misread that shift entirely. He thought strength alone would bring peace. He believed if he kept showing overwhelming power, the Scots would eventually accept English rule. But the more force he used, the more Scotland saw itself as something distinct and worth protecting. The turning point came when Robert the Bruce entered the story. At first, Edward thought Bruce was just another ambitious noble switching sides for advantage. Scotland's leading families had changed loyalties before. Edward expected Bruce to fall in line once he realized resistance wouldn't work. But Bruce wasn't like the others. When he killed his rival John Comyn inside a church and declared himself King of Scotland, he didn't ask for Edward's approval. He didn't plan to negotiate. He challenged England openly and made the fight personal. That shocked Edward more than anything Wallace had done. Bruce wasn't an outlaw leading common fighters. He was someone claiming a crown Edward believed belonged under his authority. At first, Bruce looked like he wouldn't last long. Edward sent armies after him, and Bruce lost battle after battle. He ran through forests and hills, his followers scattered, his family captured. Some of his relatives were executed, others imprisoned. Edward thought the matter was settled and that Scotland was finally broken. But Bruce refused to give up. Instead of fighting Edward's armies head-on, he used small groups of loyal fighters, moved through rough terrain, and slowly began retaking strongholds one by one. It wasn't glorious warfare. It was slow, harsh, and often desperate. But each small victory pulled more Scots to his side. Edward could not understand why the Scots still resisted. In his mind, he had done everything a king was supposed to do. He had defeated their armies, punished their leaders, and placed the land under organized rule. But he never understood what Scotland had become during those years of struggle. It wasn't just a region rebelling. It was a nation shaping its identity through resistance. The more Edward pushed, the more Scotland united. By the time Edward decided to march north again to crush Bruce once and for all, age and exhaustion had caught up to him. He was no longer the towering warrior who had fought in crusades and dominated the Welsh campaigns. But he refused to show weakness. He left London in poor health, determined to reach the border. Some chroniclers say he wanted to die in Scotland so his body could keep the campaign going even after death. Whether that story is true or not, it shows how deeply he tied his identity to this conflict. He believed ending Scotland's resistance was his final duty as king. He never reached his goal. Edward died on the journey north in 1307, only a few miles from the Scottish border. His commanders paused, not sure what to do next. Some wanted to keep going, honoring his wish to continue the campaign. Others realized the war had dragged on too long and had cost too much. When the news spread that Edward was dead, Scotland didn't celebrate loudly. But there was a quiet sense that the great shadow hanging over them had finally lifted. Edward's son, Edward II, lacked his father's discipline and determination. Within a few years, Robert the Bruce defeated the English decisively at Bannockburn, and Scottish independence gained strength rather than faded. Edward I was remembered in two very different ways. In England, many people saw him as a great king who brought order, strengthened the law, built massive castles, and stood firm against anyone who tried to weaken the crown. They admired his energy, his commitment, and the sense of authority he restored to English kingship. They saw him as the model of what a medieval king should be: commanding, fearless, and powerful. But in Scotland, his memory became something entirely different. To them, he was the king who tried to take their country, who burned towns, removed their symbols of kingship, and ruled through intimidation. He was called the Hammer of the Scots, not as a title of honor, but as a reminder of the suffering he brought. His attempts to break Scotland only strengthened its determination to remain free. The resistance that formed against him helped shape Scottish identity for generations. In the end, Edward's story isn't just about battles or sieges or political strategy. It is a story about how one man's belief in absolute authority collided with a people's belief in their right to exist as they were. Edward thought he could force Scotland into submission, just as he had done in Wales. He believed a king could shape borders, control destinies, and impose order through strength alone. But Scotland was different. Its resistance came not just from nobles, but from ordinary people who refused to accept foreign rule. Edward I changed the history of two nations, but not in the way he imagined. He pushed Scotland so hard that he helped create the unity he feared. He spent years trying to force them under English rule, but his actions made the idea of Scotland as an independent nation stronger than ever. In trying to break them, he helped define them. And that is why his legacy remains one of the most debated of any medieval king, admired by some, feared by others, and remembered by all for the enormous force of his will.